The decision to settle the civil claims is completely unrelated to the criminal case the 6 officers currently face. The city's decision to settle the civil case should not be interpreted as passing any judgment on guilt or innocence of the officers.
Okay, yeah. Well, the woman you just heard there was Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake talking about her city, Baltimore's $6.4 million settlement with the family of Freddie Gray. Now, you'll remember Ms. Gray died while in police custody in April, and that incident spurred major riots. Now, 6 police officers are now facing criminal charges. You see them there on your screen. Now, I want to remind everybody here what the prosecutor in this case, Marilyn Mosby, said shortly after the case, after she announced she'd be handling this particular one.
I've heard your calls for no justice, no peace. However, your peace is sincerely needed as I work to deliver justice on behalf of Freddie Gray.
Now, Mosby taking a lot of flack over those comments, and critics say she is not as impartial as she should be. And now that the case has settled with the Gray family, the question is, will that impact the case against the cops? And again, we talk about jurors forget about the instructions they hear, and they'll clearly be articulated that what happens in a civil case has no bearing on the criminal case. I'm sure that'll be beaten home many times by the judge, and if they want any clarifications, they'll get it. However, they still, when they turn on the news tonight, are going to see the $6.5 million is going to the Gray family. Usually you don't give somebody $6.5 million unless somebody think the other side did something wrong, right?
And if they forget by the time of the criminal trial what they saw on the news today, as you just said, the judge is going to tell them 57 times to disregard the fact that they settled for all of this money. Listen, the reality of it is, and Mayor was pointing out off camera, that you can settle for several different reasons, and it could have nothing to do with the criminal liability. In my view, it is going to affect the jurors, because bottom line is, why you give anybody $6.5 million if you didn't do anything wrong? And so that at least is going to be a part of the beyond the reasonable doubt analysis.
May I get there's a procedural thing, the clock starts ticking on these things. So before you give us math that the layman and myself are going to get lost on, why don't they just wait until the criminal trial is resolved before they do the civil one? Usually that's how, at least when I follow these things, it seems to work, that maybe, look at the Garner case, right? I mean, in the end, there was no indictment, but the family still received the settlement from the city of New York. Why don't they do it across the board?
Well, most of the time, the family doesn't receive a settlement from the city, especially if there's no indictment. So what happens is you have to go try that case. But if you look at any other criminal case, as a matter of fact, yesterday I was with Yusef Salam of the Central Park jogger case, okay? And we were talking about all the time he spent in prison on a rape that he never committed.
Yep.
And I remember listening to Mayor Giuliani and listening to the DA and everybody in the media calling these kids animals, right? And that's a lot worse than saying, hey, we're going to settle your civil case.
For folks who don't remember, this was the Wilding case with the Central Park 6.
And they served a lot of time for a rape they didn't commit. The actual rapist remained on the streets and God knows maybe raped again. And there was no fair trial that they got, but it wasn't because there was a settlement. It was because you actually had the mayor, you actually had over and over again the characterization of them being animals, people saying that they were guilty before any evidence.
Well, this is why you're a great attorney. You didn't answer my question. If you, let's say you're defending one of these 6 guys. Okay? No. Let's say you're defending one of these cops, right? Yeah. And you're trying to get an impartial jury to sit in there and give your guys the benefit of the doubt unless they're proven to be guilty. If you're going to turn around tonight and say, what are you doing, Baltimore? How is anybody going to sit in that jury pool and say, trust me, my guy's innocent, they didn't prove anything? They're going to say to themselves, they're so innocent. Why did they write a check for $6.5 million?
Richard, the issue here is that the city of Baltimore doesn't represent the police officers. Okay, and that's what we forget. And sometimes I think cities believe they do represent the individual police officers. They don't. They represent the people who live, but they represent the people who live in the city. So if you find that there was a breach of protocol, if you find that the rules and regulations were not followed and that through some negligence, okay, it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a crime, someone lost their life or was injured, the responsible thing to do is not drag your city through 3 or 4 years of litigation where the defense side's making lots of money on motions.
My only question is timing.
Well,
this case is going to trial, the criminal phase of it.
Right, but
shouldn't, in terms of just due process, that you first decide if the person's innocent or guilty in the criminal, and then even if they're not found guilty or they're not even indicted, just like we saw in New York, there still is the civil remedy for that.
No, because they're two separate standards. One is beyond a reasonable doubt, and the other one is a civil standard, which is basically showing that it's more likely than not. And the two can go on at the same time. If I'm defending one of those officers, especially when you have multiple officers involved who have different levels of culpability, I'm going to say, listen, my client's just in the car. He wasn't actually involved in hitting Mr. Gray.
But your case isn't helped if the city writes a check for $6.5 million.
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily hurt. It depends on how you can articulate that settlement, and it depends on how much of that.
The timing is doubly inexplicable. Okay, the reason why they generally wait until after the criminal case is if somebody gets convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, liability is conclusively established for civil purposes because the standard is lower and the only question is damages.
Which is a huge question, and you'll try a case on damages alone.
I got it, but put that to one side. The bigger reason why it's inexplicable is those defense lawyers are going into the court today to argue to move the case out of Baltimore because of the saturation press coverage, and they choose to settle the case and put that information out the day the motion is being argued. Well, that motion is a very, very big long shot to begin with. They just gave that motion a huge shot in the arm. The problem is I don't know where else in Maryland they can move this trial.
But that actually helps the defense.
It
because
does
if the
help
defense
the
is
defense,
trying to
but
move,
why in the world would you do that? Wittingly or unwittingly, you are really compromising or threatening to compromise the defendant's right to a fair trial,
Also,
giving the defendant an issue that didn't really exist before.
The city's writing the check, in
I think
effect, because
the city's throwing these cops under
the bus.
Okay, it's really
Under
that
the
simple.
bus.
They know that if these cops get convicted, that number is going to go up exponentially. So you know something? They're throwing them under the bus. We're settling the case. No litigation. Garner got $5.9 million. We're going to give you a little bit more. Get rid of it and be done with it, and let them go.
That's why they did it. And this is a problem in the criminal case. There's going to be an issue here, a big issue.
There's a difference in that case than there with respect to Garner. You have a person who's handcuffed. I mean, you know, and then you have different stories. You have the police, the GPS, which shows that there were lies told here. And in addition to that, again, the city is not working with the defense team. They're not. That is not their role.
It's what the average juror, whether they're going to grasp these niceties.
I ran out of time, but I want to ask you this. The number, 6.4, there doesn't seem to be any formula. I went through some other cases. I mean, people might forget Rodney King. There was no death involved. Obviously, horrible beating. 3.8 then, roughly, if you factor in inflation, 6.2 million now. I can go to other cases. There doesn't seem to be a rhyme and reason. What decides the number?
Why
I know
now?
we'll talk about Chamberlain later on.
Why today?
Well,
Why can't
the
they wait?
number is decided basically. You're going to have a meeting of the minds, and then also you have a number of factors. But to me, it's always less than what it ought to be because you're looking at a life.
No,
that's
I get
lost.
that, but I'm saying something different.
Right.
Where do they arrive?
Yeah, how do they get to the number?
Well, you arrive at that number. You look at basically. You can look at pain and suffering. You can look at the cost that was taken, basically assuming that there is any kind of other case going on. You look at costs to the family members, all of those things. And then you factor in also the cost of litigating this for the next 4 years. So those are all factors that you take into consideration.
Does it matter, Mayo, for example, if somebody were to get killed or somebody died under questionable circumstances and the city chooses to settle, same case, let's say, if it happened in New York City versus Paducah, Kentucky,
Absolutely.
that they think the city's got deeper pockets in Manhattan rather than if they go to some rural outpost?
It'll also come down to what was your earning potential sometimes. So for instance, if it's someone, you'll have an
as we
actuary
learned
who
from Ken
will look at it.
Feinberg,
Absolutely.
math gets involved. All right, coming up next, she's out of jail, but the question is she and should she be out of trouble? Kim Davis refused to issue gay marriage licenses even though it is the law of the land. The panel will debate whether she's got a legal leg to stand on. This case drives me nuts.